Why don't we go ahead and get started? We are looking for one more of our speakers to arrive, but since he's the third speaker, we can afford the luxury of him arriving. But why don't we go ahead? Today's session is focused on implementation of Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century, MAP 21. And we're going to talk today about different elements of that, starting with James Corliss, who is the Director of Transportation for America, which is a coalition of different interest groups that were formed around this reauthorization bill and continue to be focused on now at both implementation as well as the next round of authorization, which will start, who knows, hopefully early next year. And so he'll give an overview and talk about some of the issues that all of us should be focused on. And I would encourage you to have your question because there are many implementation issues associated with MAP 21 that we need to be focused on. And then I'll introduce our other speakers before they come up. But first of all, let's start off with James Corliss.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff, and good morning, everybody. Congratulations for being up at 8 o'clock in the morning on the final day of the conference to talk about MAP 21, my favorite topic. Okay, as Jeff said, we're just going to walk through, I guess from our perspective, a little bit of what we think is important to know in this transportation bill. It's a big bill. It's hundreds of pages thick. There's a lot to it, but I'll try to break this down this morning just to a sort of, in our version, sort of the highlights. Well, it's hard to see that. I like to start off these talks by showing how much fun we used to have back in the 1950s. You probably recognize Miss Concrete on the left and Miss Blacktop on the right there. That's cutting the ribbon over I-94 in Wisconsin. Point with that slide actually is that this federal transportation program actually does have its roots back in the 1950s. This is the same program that was initially authorized by President Eisenhower in 1956 to build the interstate highway system. And today it is still, it's always hard to come and talk about what Congress is up to when we're shutting down the government and we don't know when we're going to sort of have another CR and everything else. But the federal transportation funds are really critical. Even when the government was shut down, $50 billion a year was still flowing out to states and regions to spend on federal transportation programs. It's about a quarter of all funding for transportation at all levels of government comes from the federal program. As I said, about $50 billion a year. When you fill up at the pump, a gallon of gas, an 18.3 cent gallon gas tax goes into this program and goes back out to the states. That's basically sort of what we're talking about here. Since about 1991, the federal program took a turn. You may know about 1991 we had the ICE-T bill, which was then done by the late Senators Moynihan and Chafee. A pretty big departure from sort of the sort of traditional highway interstate era transportation bills. In 98 we had T21. In 2005 we had Safety Lou. We love our acronyms in DC. And as you can see in 2012, last year, we passed MAP 21. It looks like that was going up pretty steadily and then took a big nosedive, but actually MAP 21 was just a 2-year bill at $109 billion and actually was relatively flat funding. It was pretty remarkable that they actually got this bill passed a couple of years ago. Basically, we are in our own transportation fiscal cliff at the federal level. That gasoline tax I talked about that largely funds this program. Cars are getting more efficient. VMT is leveling off or declining, and those two things are basically, whether it's the federal level or state gasoline taxes, conspiring to put a lot less money into these highway trust funds and transportation trust funds. So to actually cobble together a 2-year transportation bill, they did not raise a gasoline tax and haven't since 1993, but they cobbled together a number of very, let's call them creative funding sources in order to keep this program level for 2 more years. There was big consolidation of the programs. I'll talk about that in a second, but one of the hallmarks of MAP 21 that you absolutely have to understand is what they call program consolidation. We used to have 110 programs in the federal transportation bill. MAP 21 has basically taken that down to about 6 major programs on the highway side, about 30 programs overall. There are no earmarks at all in federal policy and legislation and appropriations right now. There are no earmarks in this transportation bill. A very big departure from the past. You'll remember the Bridge to Nowhere up in Alaska. This sort of became notorious for sort of what was wrong with the federal transportation program, but no earmarks, and that's been a big deal just in terms of being able to get this bill done. Ironically, it is harder to get a bill done, it turns out, when you don't have earmarks and you can't promise members projects in their districts. MAP 21, and I'll mention this as well again in a second here, but had a big emphasis. We don't think it kind of went far enough, but it had a big emphasis on what we call performance measures. So actual quantitative measures of what you're basically buying for your investments. And this, I can tell you, being a former transportation planner from an MPO in California, is a very big deal. It is very different and a departure from how we have programmed and justified a lot of our transportation projects in the past. It's no longer okay to say on time, under budget. We're going to have quantitative measures of performance. I know this is a little hard to read probably in the room, but basically it's just a sense on the left-hand side of the old programs under the old transportation bill and how they were consolidated into these really much larger, bigger buckets and categories. On the right-hand side, basically from top to bottom, you have a highway program called the NHPP. You have a surface transportation program, big flexible pot of money that is good money to have, although that, relatively speaking, kind of went down, and the highway program increased. We have a transportation alternatives program that I'll talk about in a second, congestion mitigation, air quality for air quality projects, TDM, traffic management, transit, a big highway safety program. One of the few programs that actually really went up in size was highway safety. And finally, which I think we'll hear about this morning, the TIFIA loan program. That's the highway side, the so-called highway side of the ledger, about 80% of the whole bill. On the other side of the ledger is the transit title. I won't get into much of that this morning, but that's worth about 20% of the entire bill is the FTA program. So let's get into some of the specifics. This is a map that you can easily pull up on our website. We've done a lot of work basically trying to highlight the importance of infrastructure in general across the U.S. This is a map that you can get if you go on our website. You can plug in any address on our website, tforamerica.org, and you can pop up every deficient bridge near where you live. It's a little scary sometimes, but you can see all the red icons there are all the deficient bridges. We made a big deal out of this in the run-up to MAP 21, trying to get some of the members, especially of the Tea Party, who said we shouldn't invest at all in transportation, to get them to notice. But in MAP 21, back to what the bill did, we actually eliminated, when we talk about that program consolidation, a specific dedicated pot of money to bridge repair. And I don't have to, you all remember the I-5 bridge collapse here in Washington State. It's a very big deal for us, and it makes us, frankly, a little nervous about how this is going to play out with some of the lack of these larger flexible pots of money, but some of the lack of these other programs like bridge repair that have been consolidated. Another sort of set of programs that was heavily consolidated in MAP 21 are a lot of the smaller programs that go to fund sort of bicycle, pedestrian, active transportation infrastructure. So there were three main programs up at the top there in the old bill: the so-called Transportation Enhancements Program, Safe Routes to School, and Recreational Trails. Those were all consolidated into what we now call, and I do not like this title, but we'll have to live with it, Transportation Alternatives. It was given a haircut of about 1/3, so we lost about 1/3 of the money, about $808 million a year now spent in this program, about a little less than 2% of the overall bill. Importantly, and don't worry about all the boxes on this graphic, half of that money with the TA program goes to the states, but half of it actually gets pushed down to metropolitan planning organizations. And that is a very important thing. It's a big change in legislation, and we think it's a big opportunity to use some of those transportation alternative funds in a competitive way in the MPOs. The states is also, it's a good thing. Again, I know some of these pictures are hard to see, but point being here, this is a sort of a rendering in Oakland, California, of a bus rapid transit system and a lot of streetscape improvements and pedestrian access and bike lanes. You can use those TA funds for all these kinds of projects, and I think it's a real important funding source. Jeff asked me to talk a little bit about what we call scenario planning. So there's some very important language in MAP 21, and there has been other bills about how you actually put together long-range transportation plans. There's a lot of language in statute that really tells and guides the states and the metropolitan regions about how to put together their 20-year long-term investment plans. Importantly, in MAP 21, and we really wanted this to be sort of codified and required, but it's not required, it's permissive, but it is now in statute, is language around what we call scenario planning. And that's basically relates back to performance measures. It's sort of the idea about, similar to putting nutrition labels on food. I want to know what I'm going to get out of my transportation plan, right? What it's going to do for my region. I want to understand what, in this case, this is the Philadelphia MPO, the Delaware Valley, looking at two land use scenarios, and that's usually what you do with scenario planning, is you look at different land use scenarios. Whether we grow along transit corridors and sort of infill development, or whether we do something very different in a more sort of sprawl, low-density growth scenario, and what happens as a result of those scenarios. A lot of MPOs and states are doing this already. Well, I'd say some, maybe not enough. We'd like to see more of that happen. It's really important, though, in terms of understanding how to be more efficient about infrastructure expenditures. It is now, while permissive, it is in statute, and we had a lot of problems in the past with some of the federal highway offices not wanting some of these scenario planning exercises to go through the federally required long-range plans. It's now permissive, it's now okay to do it, it's in code. What we'd also like to see going forward, and we think there could be some real opportunities, is actually around linking expedited project delivery to actually doing really good plans. So if you do a good plan and you actually show lots of economic and environmental benefits in your scenario, we are going to be advancing, and we think we have some openings to actually make it easier for you then to build the projects that are in your long-range plan. You shouldn't have to come back a second time and do a bunch of studies, et cetera. So that's scenario planning. Performance measures, probably one of the most important things, and I would probably say one of the least understood in MAP 21. It is brand new. There's a list of performance measures I'll give you in a second. The U.S. Department of Transportation is currently actually developing guidance on all these performance measures. They are supposed to be releasing a draft of this guidance in the next few months. The shutdown kind of slowed them down. I would heavily recommend for all of you, and you can do this through our website and us, to watch what happens with these performance measures and to weigh in, because it'll be a typical federal process where there'll be drafts and finals and a public comment period. But exactly how we do these performance measures is going to be critical, honestly, for the future of everything we're talking about in this conference. We have state targets within about 18 months from now, March 2015. The regional agencies, the MPOs, are going to have to adopt soon thereafter. And here's the list of performance measures. And they're pretty basic, pretty traditional, some might say. Looking at interstate highways, NHS is the National Highway System, pavement condition, things like fatalities and injuries, but you do get into mobile source, metropolitan congestion, freight movement, and there's a whole bunch of performance measures on the transit side as well that are really important that I haven't listed up here. But here's just an example of why we think these kinds of performance measures are so important. If you've ever seen and read the TTI report, the Texas Transportation Institute every year publishes the congestion rankings, which is the most congested region in the country. That's a really widely read and covered in the media report on who hits the worst traffic. But there's a couple of issues that certainly we have with using something like the TTI index as the way that you might measure success in a region. So Atlanta, Chicago, if you can see, there's a little red bar in those circles. I don't know if I can't see the colors on here too well. Basically, that's the sort of the congested part of your average travel according to the TTI index. So you can see here in Chicago, the average trip is about 35 minutes. Atlanta, it's 57. But the way in which we do this one particular index, you're sitting in more of your trip in Chicago in traffic and less of it, relatively speaking, in Atlanta, right? If you use this index, we'd say Atlanta's doing a lot better than Chicago. When what Chicago has done is actually reduce travel time, integrate transportation land use, build out transit, and give people a shorter trip so they're home sooner. So why that would be less successful in Chicago is beyond us, and it is just an example of how we can use performance measures in exactly the wrong way. We're going to get down, we think, essentially to a debate here about what is the purpose of transportation. Is it about speed and mobility, or is it about accessibility and getting to stuff? And I hope it's the latter, and we think this debate is really going to bring this to the fore. Just a few more things before I close. Again, maybe hard things to see. These performance measures are going to be implemented on also and applied to what is called the National Highway System. This is not just the interstate highways, it's expressways and now major arterials. So if you have a major arterial in your city or your town or your suburb, these performance measures are going to be really important. I would submit to you that a lot of bus rapid transit and TOD is happening along these arterials. These are the kinds of places, especially in suburban settings, where we have a lot of infill redevelopment potential. If the feds impose a performance measure that we actually then begin to say, well, reducing delay and increasing speed is the way we're going to measure your success, you're going to find a lot of your efforts are going to get a lot harder, and you're going to have sometimes conflicting goals. I don't think the feds want to do this, but we're going to need your help to make that case in the next 12 months as they release some of their measures. This street, by the way, is a street in Michigan, an old downtown Main Street. It is on the same national highway system as this in Detroit, Interstate Highway. Speed and mobility are very appropriate to do on a facility like this, don't get us wrong. But when you're talking about a street like this, we've got different kinds of goals for it, and we have different, we ought to have different measures as well. I know folks are going to talk about TIFIA. I think that's going to be part of the other presenters. I would just say that we really think the TIFIA program, a loan program, has a great opportunity to build and expedite construction of transit projects. I think David's going to talk a little bit about this. We'd like to see other cities and regions around the country take advantage of TIFIA, because with the changes in MAP 21, transit projects can now much more readily qualify for these loans. So, good opportunities in the bill. TA program, transportation alternatives, performance measures, scenario planning. If you go to our website, we have a whole guidebook called Making the Most of MAP 21. That can help you walk through opportunities. We do think that a lot of this, we hope, the direction we're heading in federal policy is that states, and especially the metropolitan regions that are stepping up, that have a vision, that are actually doing a lot of self-help funding measures, are going to do better and get ahead and succeed. The performance measures piece is one we're going to need your help in. As I said, it is both an opportunity as well as a very significant risk if we get it wrong. Please plug into us, engage with us, because over the next 12 months, as I said, we're going to need your help. And as Jeff said, work on the next bill is going to happen really soon. And by the way, that's my last happy, feel-good happy slide, because I've given you so many. This is the Federal Trust Fund in 2015. We're driving off our own transportation fiscal cliff. Sequestration is a cut of about 8 to 10% in funding, unevenly across programs. But if we do nothing, a year from now, the cuts are going to be in the order of 80 to 90%. Because of those things I talked about. So our effort in the next few months is actually going to be rallying around trying to first and foremost increase funding for federal transportation and do it in a smart, thoughtful way that will reward what we hope is a lot of the great work you all are doing on the ground. So that's it from me, and we'll get to the next speaker.
While I'm setting up the computer, a couple thoughts. Oh, by the way, my name's Jeff Booth with Holland and Knight, and I'm also the chair of the New Starts Working Group and the executive director of the Community Streetcar Coalition, among other things. But for those of you who are transit, we've had the first piece of the performance measures put on the street through FTA announcing sort of seeking comment on what is state of good repair, and putting together your asset management plans and safety plans. And so that came out just before sequestration, or just before everybody was laid off. I think came up on Thursday, and the Thursday, October was at second or third in the Federal Register. And FTA is looking for your comment and giving an extended comment period of 90 days for the advance notice of proposed rulemaking for you to get your input on sort of the questions that they've asked to measure state of good repair, how to put together an asset management plan. And so those comments and that rulemaking will feed into the performance measures, because that's largely where transit's going to be measured on, is on those areas. So that's first comment, and all of you need to be working very hard to communicate with your delegations about the need to raise long-term funding for the program, because as James mentioned, we fall off a cliff as of fiscal year 15. So it's, and just to put it in context, to keep the program level in FY15 will require a 14-cent per gallon gas tax increase. So at a minimum, we need a 14-cent per gallon gas tax increase just to stay whole. And so Congressman Blumenauer has introduced legislation that would start with a 15-cent per gallon increase and then index the gas tax thereafter, which is something we never did, and hence we're in the situation that we're in right now. So the hope is that and as James said, that is a short-term bill, because they hope within 10 years we'll find a longer-term funding mechanism that will sustain the program going forward, just because of all the issues associated with the gas tax and changing driving, reduction in VMT and improved CAFE standards will affect sort of the sustainability of the trust fund. So we're looking for other funding sources. Our next speaker, as I set this up, let's see if it takes. Oh, it didn't take. There we go. Okay. Our next speaker is James Parsons. He's Marketing Director for the Western Region for AECOM, and he'll talk to you today about the changes that were made in the New Starts program, which were quite substantial. Okay. There we go.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning. I'm going to talk this morning a little bit on one of the detailed implementation steps of MAP 21, specifically the rating criteria for New Starts projects, transit New Starts projects. To begin that, I want to just give a little background here that MAP 21 itself did make some significant changes, both in the process, the New Starts process itself, and I'll talk briefly about that, but also more significantly in the rating criteria. FTA has gone through a process of developing the details, guidance on those criteria. They were finalized in August. There's some procedural details yet to come, and one criteria that's yet to be defined, which I'll talk about in a second as well. But to begin, the most significant changes in the process are a couple steps have been eliminated. The first step in the process, the project development step, which now includes the NEPA, is then followed by engineering, the full funding grant agreement, and then ultimately construction. The significant change here is that in addition to eliminating the alternatives analysis initial step, the first time that there's really a rating of a project using the criteria will be after the record of decision at the end of the project development phase and at the end of NEPA. And what that means is that early on in the process, you used to take that step prior to the start of preliminary engineering and usually before the completion of the NEPA process. So the transit agencies at least had some indication of where they were going to fall in the rating criteria. What it means now is that you need to be looking at where your project may fall in the criteria much earlier in the process on your own, if you will. For example, I was recently involved with a project here in Seattle in which when the draft criteria came out in January, we actually went through a process of looking at how that project would score and used that as a basis for the comments the agency made back to FTA about the criteria themselves. A couple other significant changes in the process are that for those projects that are relatively small, less than $100 million, or in which there'd be significant overmatch, there's a system of warrants that potentially could be used in certain circumstances to avoid or to actually forego the entire rating process. The procedures and guidance behind that really are yet to be defined. The new starts and small starts criteria and weighting are now the same. That's a significant change as well, although the actual thresholds are different between the two types. And then there's a combined 5-step rating system that runs from high, medium, low, down to low. And there are 6 project justification criteria, with a new criteria added for congestion relief, and I'll talk a little about that in a minute, and where that criteria might go, or where I would say in the transit industry we'd like to see it go. And then all criteria have an equal weighting, which is another change in the process. And there are also new financial criteria and weighting for those as well. So this illustrates or tries to do a comparison of the old framework and the new framework. I know this is a little bit hard to see from the back, but if you look at the actual titles of the criteria themselves, there isn't a whole lot of change. The old justification rating was based on 6 criteria. The new justification rating is based on 6. There's been operating efficiencies eliminated, but congestion relief added. And then the weightings among the criteria have changed. So currently are under the new scheme, each criteria is equal. Under the old scheme, mobility improvements, economic development, cost effectiveness, and land use all were rated essentially at 20%, with operating efficiencies and environmental benefits at 10. And then under the financial rating, there have been some changes, both, as I said, in the factors that are being looked at, and then also in the weighting scheme. Another major change, and one that frankly is one that I think everyone in the transit industry is quite happy about, is that the whole basis for comparison has now shifted. FTA in general favors comparisons to existing conditions for reasons that I think become pretty obvious when you really recognize that the biggest difficulty in forecasting future ridership on transit systems has always been the difficulties of forecasting future economic development, future demographics, particularly in corridors that are rapidly growing. So that's a major source of error and a major difference between projects, say a project being built in a mature transit corridor versus one that's maybe not so mature, and then big differences in what the future forecasts will look like. Given that said, though, the criteria also allow the use of a 10-year and 20-year horizon against a future no-build. And if you do choose to use that future condition, then there's a 50-50 weighting between existing conditions and the future design year comparison. And then the final major change, which is, I think, one that really helps the process, is that we'll no longer have to develop the TSM baseline alternative. And for those familiar with the New Starts process, frankly, that was always a bit of a game, I guess I would say. I mean, first of all, the difficulty in explaining that to the general public, explaining that to local decision makers, what this alternative was and how it was dealt with, and why it was there, was always a challenge. And then, to be quite honest, over the years, I think we in the industry got to sort of gaming that. And by that I mean, the challenge was always to try to get a TSM alternative that was pushing the boundaries of what it cost on the high side and what it and on the low side of performance, for obvious reasons. You were trying to drive up the performance of your alternative that you were using as a comparison. So eliminating that, while I think when it was first established there was a lot of logic for creating an alternative like that, I think will really help in the overall understanding of the process, and certainly help in the comparative analysis of projects across the country. Another factor here is that FTA is moving, to the extent they can, to use standard factors rather than detailed analysis. And the biggest change here is the development of a model called the STOPS model, which I guess is out now, and I think it's being tested in a number of places around the country. but it essentially allows you, if you don't want to use your local forecasting model, to use this more simplified process to do your ridership forecasting and then ultimately the VMT calculations, which become part of the environmental criteria. Maybe when we get to the question and answer session, if there are folks here that have had some experience doing a comparison between the results coming out of both the STOPS model and the traditional regional forecasting models, I'd be interested to hear. I think in general what we're going to see, just because of the way the STOPS model works, is when you're dealing in mature transit corridors, one that have, say, large levels of bus ridership now, and dealing with an incremental model locally as opposed to a synthetic model, the differences between the STOPS model forecasts and the regional model forecasts are probably not going to be big. But when you go to sort of greenfield transit corridors, if you will, and rapidly developing areas, then that's an area where you may see some difference. The final sort of issue on the methods is this new congestion relief measure that has yet to be determined. At least, I mean, I think what most people feel is that criteria, the congressional intent behind that criteria, was probably focused at traffic congestion. Most of us in the transit industry realize that transit really is not about reducing traffic or traffic congestion, that you continually have this problem of whatever you pull off the roads will fill up and become congested again. And that when the actual details of this criterion get worked out, we'd like to see it address issues of overall mobility congestion on the transit system, and improvements in mobility, and not just the traffic congestion element. The criteria themselves and what they really mean in terms of what become important measures, I want to go through fairly quickly here, and then if we have time during the Q&A session, we can drill down into some of these if there's interest in talking about it. But in terms of the mobility calculation and ultimately the cost-effectiveness calculations, we're now moving to the number of trips on the project as opposed to travel time savings, which was the old method of calculation. And this is a big change and a significant one. Travel time savings, frankly, favored those projects looking at long-distance trips, resulted in some decisions about projects that in the long run might have benefited the typical journey-to-work trip, suburb to central city, but in some cases may not have given you the best decisions about how you constructed your transit system. So trip distance no longer matters. What really matters in these calculations is how many people are using the system. The other factor that's brought in is for transit dependents. They're counted as essentially, they're weighted by 2, so they're counted as 2 riders. Transit-supported plans and policies and the demonstrated performance of those are now becomes pretty critical in the rating criteria. The tools that affordable housing component is also a significant measure. The change in VMT is the primary basis for the environmental rating, and the VMT change can be calculated either using the STOPS model or your local travel forecasting model. And then obviously project costs, and that really hasn't changed, both the annualized capital cost as well as operating cost of the system, which comes into the calculation of cost effectiveness. But now that cost effectiveness measure becomes essentially a annualized cost per rider, as opposed to the travel time savings being the benefit under the old method. And then for the land use criteria, it's really all about the demographics around the system in the station areas, that being the total population and employment, it becomes critical in that measure. Other factors include CBD parking cost and spaces and parking spaces per employee, which also factor into land use. I mentioned the affordable housing component as part of the criteria. And then when it comes to the financial elements of the evaluation, the local share of capital costs comes into play as a significant factor. Obviously, the higher the share, the better your rating. the financial condition of the sponsor, which really has not changed from the previous requirement, the commitment of capital and the agency's ability to keep ongoing operating funds available, and then finally an assessment of the reasonableness of the financial plan. Those all become significant factors in developing the rating criteria. And with that, I will end on this slide, but if we have some time at the end and there's interest, we can talk in detail about the various criteria and how the calculations work. Thank you.
Next speaker is David Yale with Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And for those of you who may not be aware, LA Metro really led the effort with Mayor Villaraigosa to expand the use of TIFIA in this last authorization bill. And as James said, this is something that as chair of the New Starts Working Group, as you look at the constraints and the demands on the program, I think we're going to see more and more projects looking at TIFIA as a way, in effect, to buy down your New Start share by leveraging your local monies to sort of enhance your prospects for securing funding through the New Starts or Small Starts program. And so I think David will talk about that and how they're doing that in LA and other ideas they have going forward in the next authorization bill.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning. Good morning. Sorry I was a little late this morning. I am David Yale, Executive Officer for Countywide Planning and Development at Metro. And I have a slide that kind of starts off where James left off. It's something that came out last week from ITEP. And for the life of me, I don't know who they are, but I do give them credit, though. And this shows the value of the gas tax over time. And you've seen slides like this. It's hard to see here, but they've actually got the Prius effect, I'll call it, broken out from the inflation effect. So you can see the value of the gas tax is mostly dropping just because it doesn't keep up with inflation, but also for efficiency of our vehicles is getting better. So over time, I think this inflation thing is the main thing we've got to fight in fixing the gas tax. We're working at Metro on getting the gas tax indexed in any manner possible, even if it means a loss of revenue at the beginning. Because over time, it's that inflation thing we need to get fixed. One of the ideas that we've had and we've been pursuing to deal with this is, of course, and this is another view of the same problem. It's the trust fund graph looking over time and the loss of funds from it. We've been working on ways to resolve the issue of the declining value of the gas tax through borrowing, at least to get us to whatever's next. And my presentation is more focused on this problem that, implementing MAP 21 is fine, but we really need to fix this problem. On the left here is the text of the Reason Foundation's arguments against indexing the gas tax, and my counter arguments on the right. And what I really want to say about this slide is I think that global demand for oil will outstrip supplies in the post-petroleum economy. So if we can index the gas tax, it's going to go up faster than inflation because we have a finite resource that it's based on. And in the near term, you're going to see gas prices falling. We saw some news here in Seattle in the papers here about low gas prices by Christmas that are going to be in Seattle area, maybe $3.15 a gallon. That's a temporary thing coming out of the Midwest where they're doing a lot of petroleum development here domestically. But over time, it's going to change, and I think we need to get the index in place now. Our proposal for dealing with this are two different borrowing programs. I'm going with the first one, which is the one we didn't get, our America Fast Forward tax credit bonds. This is our sort of as simple as we could make it on how these bonds work. The Treasury Department gives you a tax credit for your interest costs on your loan. So we should start with the state and local bond issuer here. The bond issuer raises the funds by getting bond investors to buy the income stream, essentially, that you've got. The transportation projects are built with those bond proceeds, and those create jobs and do all the things transportation does. The bond investor, or the issuer, pays the principal back to the trustee, and the bond investor goes to the Treasury for the tax credit. Now, we've set this up in our latest iteration so that an institutional investor like CalPERS could use these and then take a credit from their income tax withholding. So we think that broadens the market and allows them not only to go to the Treasury for tax relief, but also for withholding reliefs on the payroll that they, or the retirees that they're paying out money to. So this America Fast Forward bond proposal is not a new idea. We've been working on it for a couple years now, but it has the potential to raise a lot more money than our TIFIA idea, which is already in MAP 21, I'm going to talk about next. Our tax-exempt borrowing right now at 3.25% can raise about $207 million for every $10 million a year. The tax credit thing could raise $549 million for every $10 million. So there's a leveraging effect here we're trying to portray in this slide that these tax credit bonds can get you. And we're going to be working on getting these things. They're not new. The qualified tax credit bond programs in law, there are 6 of them, or 5 of them. The zone academies is for this one. I don't know what these are for. But this was maybe more general. But schools, energy, forestry, all have these programs. We want the same thing for transportation. This would be the 6th class of those 5 that I pointed out. And I'm sorry my slide got made smaller here. We're proposing a $45 billion cap on these over a 10-year period. This keeps the cost down for the federal government. If we do get this, they'll be very competitive. We propose 65% go to discretionary projects and 35% by formula to states. The maximum maturity will be 35 years, and the scored cost is expected to be under $10 billion, and that's the relationship to my gas tax slides. This is a low-cost way of developing funds for transportation. All the rules will apply, Davis-Bacon, NEPA, and all the rest on these bond proceeds. I want to turn now to TIFIA. You can see here what we used to have in the TIFIA program. This was much easier for us to get in through Congress because the cost is much lower for the federal government. We're basically paying them their borrowing rate back. So it was very low cost for them because they're just borrowing and passing through their rates to us. And the U.S. Treasury is enjoying great rates right now. Last week, if you closed the TIFIA loan, you could get 3.5% for a 25-year loan. About a year ago, when we closed the Crenshaw loan, we got 2.43%. Those rates are locked in for 5 years. So if I could close a loan in a couple months at 3.5%, I don't have to draw it down for 5 years, and the loan rates that you're going to get on your regular borrowing is likely to be much higher than 3.5%. So the TIFIA loan has a great benefit there in terms of being a hedge on rising interest rates. But you can see what we did in MAP 21 here. $750 million in the first year and $1 billion in the second, and now it's over. MAP 21 is over. We got to do this again now. So $10 billion is what you can get with this $1 billion of TIFIA investment by the federal government, which is essentially a loss reserve, that $1 billion for loans that don't necessarily pay for themselves. So some bad apples aren't going to pay their loans, is the assumption here, and they're putting aside the money to pay those off if the worst should happen. Under Safety Lou, the TIFIA program had a 33% cap. Only a third of the project could be TIFIA. Now under MAP 21, 49% can be TIFIA. But the important thing for transit is this springing lien waiver, which I want to spend a moment on. And a 33% of the old cap really applies to that waiver. If you go up to 49%, you can't get the waiver. If you have any pre-existing borrowing, getting the waiver is what makes this work for you. And I want to talk about what the hell a springing lien is and how it works. This is what a bond attorney would describe as the waterfall. So our senior measure our revenues, pay off our senior debt, and then our subordinate debt, and after that, a TIFIA loan, and after that, we can do the direct services and projects that we do with our funding. The old springing lien requirement required that if you took a TIFIA loan and you declared bankruptcy, you would jump up to be with the senior debt people. Now, the guys who gave you this money and you're paying back have agreements with you that say, you can't do that. You can't agree to allow the federal government to jump up and be in line with you in the waterfall. So you can get a waiver now from the federal government, and we're working through the language with TIFIA right now to do this, where if you have 33% participation, you're a well-rated credit, and you have non-project related revenue like a sales tax or a gas tax or anything but a toll, you can get this springing lien waived. And that's hugely important for transit. Most of the transit operators are relying on something like a sales tax. They're not relying on their fares to actually build their projects. They're relying on other taxes. So the springing lien is hugely important for us, and we're working through getting that actually codified in a loan, so we can all see what it's going to be like. And that's the end of my show. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, now we're open to your questions. I guess I would say to each one of you, as you're looking at implementation, if you were to summarize sort of what you're focusing on, what is the most important issue you see in terms of implementation of the program in the areas that you talked about going forward?
I think for us it's the performance measures and making sure that they actually work in the same direction that I think a lot of this conference is focused on rather than contrary.
And James, just to follow up on that, how can they shape that? How can they get involved locally to help influence that or make that happen, as well as what is T for America doing going forward in the next authorization bill to refine or perfect what was in there in terms of performance measures?
Well, as I said, that on the highway side, the transit measures are out. The highway side is coming, and especially around this notion of defining congestion, speed versus access. We have to weigh in. We've got to hear your voices on the local level about what that means and getting it right. We'll certainly be doing. We have template letters we can get those out to folks, make it easy for you to weigh in. These can be really arcane, as you well know, Jeff, processes with the US DOT. I don't know how much of a comment period they'll have, but it's really critical. The other thing I would say that I guess I missed in my presentation is, if you're with an MPO or a transit agency or a state, do not wait for these measures. There's a lot of angst out there about what this means, and I think people are kind of waiting to see what USDOT will come out with. If you're doing an update to your regional transportation plan or your state plan, we would really highly recommend putting in a much broader set of measures and actually experimenting and innovating now, so that when USDOT suggests the way they want to do things, you understand what that means for you and how that's either going to work for you or against you. And we're certainly the next bill going to be pushing to broaden some of those performance measures. I think maybe we'll get one extra measure in there. So we've got a menu to sort of figure out exactly what that would be. It's something probably for us going to be around access to jobs, or even sort of accessibility or affordability.
Well, and I just, as you're talking, James or Jim, this kind of goes to your discussion on the congestion relief, but historically we've measured congestion through level of service, and we're still sort of measuring pavement conditions in sort of a fix-it-first approach. But the challenge in the congestion relief measure for the New Starts program, and also the performance measures, how do we frame congestion in a way that's not just focused around the automobile? And I think we have a chance to do that under the New Starts program. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I think we need to look at a larger mobility measure and talk about congestion in the terms of travel congestion, not just roadway congestion. And so, this sounds trite, but you build a rail system and you give people the option to get out of the congested roadway, and you need to have credit for that. That just the notion of the only credit is if you can actually remove cars from the road and make it flow freer. But all those people on the train are now out of the congestion, and they're benefiting from that. So that needs to be, I think, brought into the measure. To get back to your earlier point, and I guess my presentation was focused on the rating criteria for New Starts, but frankly, without funding, those criteria don't mean anything. So I guess the biggest angst right now is where the funding for the entire New Starts program is going. And without a robust program, the rating criteria don't mean anything. So
I think we painted a fairly stark picture of that in the Highway Trust Fund. So if you haven't walked away from the session yet, you should have a sense that, yes, that is a priority number one issue that we're focused on. And just to give you some context legislatively, there's a window between now and the middle of December as they're working on a broader budget deal that, to me, that is our window to get something done where the gas tax increase is part of a broader budget package where it sticks out. It doesn't stick out. And if we miss that window and we lapse into next year, then we run into being an election year and the members of Congress getting nervous about raising the gas tax, and that's where everybody starts sweating bullets at that point. And I just would say to both the highway and transit folks that starting the spring, if we don't have a gas tax increase, you're on the highway side, you're basically slowing down and doing nothing because you can't be assured of getting repaid. So projects will stop. If you're on the transit side under Title VI, you have to begin announcements of service reductions to your riding public, because by law under Title VI you must inform your riders based on the importance of federal dollars to your sort of overall operating revenues. The impact then is that you're going to start service cutbacks. And so the real question for transit agencies and the communities, how do we communicate to the public, and how do we get the public to communicate to Congress how important that is to them? And so that's a conversation that will be had, and we're hoping that we don't have to have that conversation because we have a gas tax increase or other funding source. But it is a very acute issue that we'll start having to address this spring in order to give the public time to comment and weigh in before service reductions are announced on October 1st. So that's something to keep in mind that is coming, and you need to plan for that. David, what would be, sort of, as you're looking at the implementation, what is the one thing folks should be focused on?
Well, for us, the big change was the Transportation Alternatives Program, actually. The wiping out of the T program left us with a host of T projects in our TIP that are now not funded, except that the overlap is pretty big. About 85% of our T projects are eligible for the new program and 15% are not. But in California, the development of the Governor Brown's active transportation program, where that's been folded in there, is a big focus of ours. The state's going to do half the programming, and the MPOs are going to do the other half. Well, these projects are inherently local, so how are we going to get the state to weigh in first with their funding so that we can fill in around what they did? There's a big debate about this going on. Do we have our program done first at the MPO level and then the state fills around us, or the other way around? And there's some confusion about that. Do you segregate out the projects into two pots and two applications? And does the urbanized areas within a large MPO have to have different little pots, or can you do it all as one? So we're working through all those issues here 2 years after the bill is passed. And just like the T program started out, the apportionment's piling up, and we're not using it on actual projects yet. So I think that's a real important thing to iron out quickly and get those projects started again. The other thing that I think is a problem with MAP 21 is the disconnect of the CMAQ program from the air pollution measures. All we've done is grandfathered in the measures from pre-MAP 21. We haven't continued to update them. As the air quality worsens in a region, you should be getting more of that money, and as it gets better, you should be getting less of that money, and that's no longer happening. And I think that's a sign that the CMAQ program might go away if we don't keep it connected to those performance measures. California just passed a law, and the governor signed it, which again connects the CMAQ program to those air quality measures, at least within California. So I hope to get that back in the next bill.
Okay. Any questions? Yes, Ron.
Jeff, there's a lot of conversation about contacting your congressional leaders to support these sorts of things. For those of us lucky enough to be in a district where it is supported or they do get it, is it still important to let those people know that we support it so that they have a body of data to support their positions? And two, is it effective for us to contact members of Congress outside of our district? Do they listen to non-constituents, and does it help them in any way? So how can we be most effective?
I don't know that they listen to non-constituents, but I do think the more people you weigh in, and I think the other issue I would say is that if it's just us speaking, it's perceived to be self-interest. We really need to engage other stakeholders, other people. I mean, especially like on the transit ridership issue, there are major employers who are utterly dependent on transit to get, I mean, hospitals, major institutions, your like hotels depend on transit to get their workers to work every day. And those are not folks we've traditionally not asked to weigh in on this issue, but need to understand the implications of what happens if there's not a gas tax increase on the ability to provide transit service, or the ability to do various road or highway projects or sidewalk or pedestrian projects are in jeopardy in the absence of getting a gas tax increase. And I think we need to build our coalitions far broader than we've ever built them locally to weigh in with the delegation. And the other thing I've been hearing from folks is, they talk about the need for more money, but people haven't said, no, you need to raise the gas tax. So when folks are weighing with the delegation, be very clear, we need to raise a revenue source, because they need to hear that it's not this amorphous funding, because we still have to wrestle with the issue, because they're hearing this from the Tea Party side of the conversation. We can just finance everything. I mean, so that's sort of the answer, is we'll just finance everything, and finance is a component of the picture, but we need money. and I think it's a dodge to avoid the issue of raising the gas tax, and that pressure needs to be exerted on delegations. Yes?
Concerning those other funding sources you keep referring to, what would that be? Other examples of other funding?
Well,
besides the gas tax?
There's lots of talk. We talked about, James. Do you want to address that? I mean, there's VMT. There's various sources. I mean, lots of ideas have been kicked around, but nobody seems to coalesce around anything yet.
I mean, David mentioned the sort of the either indexing or actually swapping to a sales tax. So if you flip it from an excise tax to a sales, then it's a % on the cost of gas. It may go down if the price of gas goes down, but long term it'll go. I mean, Senator Boxer has mentioned this. It's being forwarded by a number of folks. We don't think the VMT fee is not going to happen anytime soon. The states are going to have to lead the VMT fee, much as they did the gas tax 100 years ago. You can also go upstream and put a wholesale tax on refiners. You could put a fee on a barrel of oil. There are other, things out there. But I think generally what we're talking about, I think, is either a gas tax indexing, swap to a sales tax, or some combination thereof.
Yeah. Yes.
My name's Eric Krieger from St. Louis. I'm a realtor and a founder of the Transit Alliance in St. Louis, broad-based coalition, Sierra Club, Consolidation United, Jobs for Justice to the regional chamber, et cetera. I think that's the kind of collaboration we need, and if we can activate the local alliances in that effort, who's leading the charge? Is T4 America aligned with Locus? Do you have the same positions, and to get your positions in an effective way that we can help communicate them? And are you aligned with the realtors, our smart growth department?
Yes to all the above, and we're in the same shop as Locus. The realtors have been on our executive committee for a long time, and actually exactly what the coalition you just mentioned is actually what we're trying to build going forward. We've been working with a lot of local and regional chambers around the country trying to get them engaged because they haven't typically gotten engaged at the federal level. And I do think that's exactly the kind of diversity of voices we need. As Jeff said, the industry itself is not going to be able to win the day on this. It's got to come from a broad base of local constituents.
If we ought to give you our card.
Yes, I want to talk to you in particular. Yeah.
Well, and just, I'm going to do some promotion for James. One of the things he's also trying to do is to reach out to select cities around the United States, to reach out with mayors and elected officials locally to have them engaged. So if you have your mayors, your elected officials that are sort of attuned to these issues and supportive of the issues, they should reach out to T4 America because they're really trying to organize those folks to be a force in the next authorization bill.
So we have an actual proposal that'll be coming out next week in draft form to raise revenue. We have a menu approach for just this reason, and we need support, agencies, local governments, local business groups endorsing this. So talk to me after.
David, I had a question for you on the qualified tax. To what extent is that tied to the municipal tax credits that are on the table for purposes of sort of this broader budget deal? Are they tied to that? Are they separate from that? Or how do they relate?
Well, your current tax exempt borrowing was threatened at one point last year, and we want to draw a distinction between our proposal and that problem. We do not, and of course all local government does not want to see the loss of that tax exempt borrowing.
Right.
What we're going after is the rest of the interest cost for local infrastructure. We think it's smart for the federal government to buy out those interest costs to enable us to accelerate infrastructure. It's a long-term commitment of the federal government to repay that interest, and these are long-term assets. So we want to draw a clear line. We're not trying to undo that. These are volume capped, as I said, so only 45 billion of them will be available nationally, making them extremely competitive to get. So we'll need a New Starts-like process to figure out who's going to enjoy using these things.
Okay. Question, yes.
I was hoping to leave the conference with a better understanding on MAP 21 of the evaluation criteria to get entering engineering and full funding grant. And the sessions I've been in haven't quite gotten to that.
What specific, what are you looking for? Maybe
Is it a risk assessment like it used to be under the prior process?
okay, Rich. Okay, Rich Diamond's here. Probably should talk to him. But I'm going to make sure you report back to your colleagues. Those are still things to be determined in terms of what. Okay, FTA has laid out in the FAQs what entry to project development looks like, and you should look at the FTA website for the FAQs that talk about different elements of the program as to where we are to date that will lay out what entry to project development looks like. Entry to engineering has not yet been laid out, and FTA needs to articulate that first through guidance and ultimately perhaps through rulemaking as to what that looks like. I will point to you and say the statute does say that entry to engineering occurs after finalization of the NEPA process, after adoption of the LPA into the long-range fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan, and after it is adopted locally. So we do know that about the timing of when entry to engineering takes place, and we do know that in order to get into engineering, you must be rated and evaluated based on the criteria. So that we do know because that's laid out in the statute.
FDA used to have a checklist of the spot reports and risk assessments.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering, even though you can't answer it now, when would
Okay,
the definition of that
okay, Rich,
take place?
you want to answer? Because I have my own thoughts about that.
Well, okay, so, I'm Rich Steinman with FTA. I covered a little bit of this on Sunday, but I'll do it again now.
Stand up,
Stand up.
please.
So anyway, Jeff's absolutely right. The statute does describe specifically what the minimum is to get into engineering. It is finishing NEPA, it's finishing the LPA. We're still working on the details, and I think that one of the things we're looking at is the same idea of a checklist of what it is that it takes. We're still trying to define what that might be that's the same as or more than, because it can't be less than, what it takes to finish the NEPA process. So that's where we're coming on that. We expect to come out with some draft guidance on that by the end of the year. The furlough, I think, has pushed us back, so now I've been saying around the first of the year, leaving the definition of what around means and which year I'm talking about. Regular calendar, lunar, lunar New Year. It's probably not Jewish New Year because that's the past, right? So I'm stuck with
You get the fiscal years passed too, so you're.
not that. Anyway, around the first of the year, we're going to come out with some draft guidance that'll try to make a proposal. We're considering how we might want to work over the next couple of months to try to get some input on that. I can't say we've figured it out yet, but we're thinking about how we might do that. So understand that it's probably going to look not dramatically different than where we were. On the full funding grant agreement side, that really hasn't changed. The statute is still talks about full funding grant agreement. I don't think anybody is really seriously considering changing what we require to get a full funding grant agreement, which is pretty much a pinned down estimate of costs, a fully pinned down financial plan, projects that meet the justification criteria that you heard a couple minutes ago. So that really hasn't changed, and the statute really didn't make any changes in what an FFGA is or does or when it happens. So I think unless there are some suggestions that come back about how to change it, I don't think you see us changing much on FFGA. So again, look for some draft guidance around the first of the year, and then we'll have a formal conversation with some comments, and then make it final.
Yeah, here's, and let me frame it this way. Before we had a checkpoint at final design, that was and that was intended to both have another re-rating of the project to the extent there was a scope change. It was another look at project cost estimates, because at that point you locked in your project cost estimate before you began your FFGA conversation. That checkpoint is over. It's no longer part of the statute. In effect, PE and final design have been merged into the engineering phase. So the upside of that is it now opens the door to design, build, or other project delivery approaches. The downside is then so to the extent you make a major scope change, you could affect the competitiveness of your project, and you won't know until you're trying to get a full funding grant agreement. And moving NEPA earlier into the process means that then if you're in engineering and you discover, oops, or an issue has arisen, like an annual burial ground on one project I worked on during final design, or a flower that existed only in this one place in the state of North Carolina, you now have to go back and reopen the NEPA process, which could have a scope change effect. That could affect project cost and your rating and evaluation. So that change introduces issues. And so part of what FTA is wrestling with, and what all of you should wrestle with as you're looking at the delivery of your project, is because I get this great sense from folks, I want to get into project development, there's a rush to move the project forward. But if you're a new start, you have a 2-year statutory limitation on completing NEPA. So now it's like, okay, be careful what you ask for, because you got 2 years to get it done. And then once you get it done, then you're stuck. And then if you have to reopen it, you're back in the do loop. You're back. You have to step back and basically go back into PD to finalize the NEPA document before you can get into engineering again. So those issues are issues that you are looking at moving projects forward need to wrestle with. And I don't know if you're like cities that I'm working in, especially if there are elected officials involved. I'm sure there's not elected officials involved in any of your projects. They all want it done yesterday. And there's this quest to get it done, perhaps sometimes driven by their term limits or re-election or what have you. But that pressure can cause you to do rushed decision-making that in the end could cost you more time, not less time, if you have to double back and repeat steps in the process because you move too quickly. So those are things to think about as we look at the change. Looks like you want to say anything you want to add to that, Jim?
Yeah, I think the concern right now is the uncertainty and risk in a process that's people aren't totally comfortable with yet. And as I said in my presentation, I think one thing you need to do is very on in the process, look at where you are in those rating criteria. The other thing I think that's going to happen, and I've seen this on a couple projects that are, at the point of midstream, let's say on an EIS, is the tendency will be to carry it much further before you go to the project development phase, even to the point of issuing a draft EIS before you ask to enter project development. And along with that, I think, is a higher level of design that's being carried through. Typically, you're going to finish PE as part of the NEPA process on most projects in order to really define in detail the impacts and assess them. So,
well, and to that end, what's unaddressed in that then is, okay, what's eligible for local match?
Right.
And that's one of the issues FTA needs to wrestle with, is that at what point, what activity qualifies as local match? If you're going to a higher level of design and engineering before you even get into project development, will that be eligible as local match? Which then means from a project finance standpoint, you're coming up with more local dollars earlier in the process to get to a higher level of design. So those are all some of the uncertainties that need to be clarified and you need to consider as you're looking at moving your projects through this revised process. Yes?
Get back to the federal gas tax. I'm going to advocate for that. I want to know what fraction of that I can expect or I should be used for transit versus roads.
I don't think we're going to see, tell me if you disagree, James. I don't think we're going to see a split or change in the split from 80-20.
Well, what is it now?
It's not quite 80-20.
Before you factor in the flexing of funds.
Correct, yes.
So you can actually flex it over to transit. And if we keep that flexibility, you could actually use more of it for transit if you want.
This is actually a really important point because we spent many years early on at T4 trying to go at this 80-20 split, 80 highways, 20 transit. It is not the way to go at this.
Right.
I can tell you now from all the scars in my back. What we need to think about are much more innovative approaches, which we are going to try to advocate along with a gas tax increase, i.e. a metropolitan mobility program. Let's actually empower metropolitan regions with a pot of money that they can then take a lot of these great projects and fund themselves. The TIFIA loan program. Let's have a program where we reward regions that raise their own sales taxes. There's a lot of innovative things out there that I think we have. The Tiger program, that we need to think a little bit beyond the modes, because that is not going to, when you get a bit more creative than that.
And I just, as you all are developing your performance plans, you're not wed just to those criteria. I heard, talking to the Portland region, they've got a whole set of criteria. In part, they're allowing state law to drive some of that, where there's a clear greenhouse gas and VMT target goals. You can use scenario planning as a way to sort of paint a different picture for your community, to use scenario planning as a way to frame a different investment scenario that then could result in more highway dollars flexed to transit, to deal with the elements of the program that are part of the scenario that you'd like for your community. So there are tools there, if used well, can help drive that decision making to get more money to transit. But it's so being an advocate at the local level and being an advocate at the MPO table to try to shape that conversation can bring more money to the transit side, as well as more money to bike and ped and other activities as we create a multimodal solution in a lot of these communities. So take advantage of that and be active at that level. Any questions? Any other questions? Yes.
So what I thought I heard in your presentation, Mr. Corliss, had to do with the performance measures, and you talked about, I think, wanting to move away from more of the mobility measures toward the access measures.
Mm-hmm.
So mobility to me sounds more like congestion relief, which is a whole other discussion. But could you talk about some examples of what you would see as good measures, performance measures for access as opposed to mobility?
Sure, and boy, there's entire conferences on this topic, right? So what we really want to make sure that the feds don't do is actually have one measure for congestion that everybody will be scored against and nothing else, right? That's the first thing. And I don't want it to be that travel time index, which is basically a reliability measure on congested versus uncongested. It's a fine measure. It's interesting, but Chicago shouldn't be dinged for it. I mean, back to the congestion discussion we had a little bit earlier, I absolutely agree with Jim about, basically getting the benefits of transit in there. One easy way to do that on congestion is per capita, right? So let's have a measure that not just of the delay on the highway, but of congestion per capita, so that the entire population is actually benefiting if the congestion goes down or goes up, and if it goes up, people who aren't in that congestion should be sort of credited. And then generally speaking, we're a much bigger fan of overall travel time, as I was telling you earlier, because we think travel time itself actually kind of gets to both the mobility and accessibility. It's both how fast you're going, but also how far you have to go. And if we're successful on the livable communities scenario planning, you should have to go not as long to get to more places, right? It'll take a lot of time to get there, but that's not just about how fast you travel. So travel time is a good one. Doing things per capita and giving transit credit is a good one. There's a number of different measures out there. There's a lot of really good work more recently done by the Eno Foundation on performance measures, and we have some things on our website too.
Go ahead.
We're talking about the livability. We looked at other measures of different modes for access. So if access is by walking or bicycle,
Yeah.
in combination with our traditional measures.
Yeah, and a lot of states, I think Washington State, I know MassDOT, Massachusetts just came up with a sort of a mode shift measure to actually increase mode share. I mean, that's a sort of a typical one. I'd really highly recommend in the San Francisco Bay Area, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, MTC, had a lot of performance measures that try to take in not only active transportation but health. So check those out from a long-range plan at an MPO. I think those are pretty innovative.
Well, I think some of this is, it's part of what we got as we were looking at this measure was sort of how much investment would be required at the MPO level to begin to capture some of that sort of the trip not taken, the trip that currently doesn't show up in the travel demand model. But I think, as James said, there are several regions that have already gone there. And if you're trying to drive your region, point them to other peer MPOs that have actually begun to move in that direction to be able to develop that measure. But it may require some investment on the part of the MPO to begin to capture that information. Yes?
Not a question, but just a follow-up to some information that Jim Parsons presented. So just a real-world local example. Here in Seattle, we're doing a federally funded streetcar planning analysis. It was actually funded as an AA when there was an AA. We're completing that work early next year. We're using the STOPS model at FTA's urging. It's showing really promising results in terms of performance, but we've honed in on an alignment here in downtown, and we're looking at mixed running versus exclusive running. Exclusive running is looking really, really promising for streetcar, but then we're looking ahead as we enter project development and looking at that congestion relief performance measure and what it might mean for general operations versus overall operations. So, I mean, this is a real issue that a lot of us here around the country are really grappling with as we kind of think about how we evaluate or how the FTA is going to evaluate our project. So it's something that.
And I'm going to make my pitch to this person over here that
We
that I hope we have a different congestion relief measure for core capacity than we do for new starts or small start projects. Because I think when we talk congestion for core capacity, we're talking about something different than we're talking about congestion for a new start or small start project in terms of what we mean by congestion relief. And I'm hoping that they will bifurcate that and have different measures based on the program goals of those different programs.
I want to add something here. Don't forget about your operating costs. The protected right-of-way for transit is hugely important to your ongoing operating costs. If you're going to slow it down in traffic, you're going to pay more to operate it because you're going to need more service out there to keep the headways up.
So on
We
the
could have a
congestion
we could have
relief
a
measure,
philosophical conversation about that. Go ahead, Jim.
I would just strongly urge everyone to weigh in on that and the way it gets structured, because you're exactly right. I mean, it's if the intent was traffic congestion, let's try to broaden it out. So.
What we just step in, I mean, okay, I'll now put on my executive director for Streetcar Coalition hat. Streetcars are transportation, but they're also a means to create mobility and to move people and to create the opportunity for economic development. And rather than seeing it as one versus the other, they have different roles. And we need to recognize those different roles in the different technologies. Because I'm convinced as we look at larger metropolitan areas that have built out their sort of fixed guideway system, that we're now looking at a next generation of sort of the infill transit investments that begin to look at BRT and streetcars as a way to create infill, to create that last mile trip that the sort of the spine of the current fixed guideway system doesn't address. And so we need to allow the criteria to respond to those different needs, all of which are transportation and all of which serve an important mode or role, and not pit one versus the other, because I think they're all part of the network. That would be my politics to sort of balance my New Start working group and my Streetcar Coalition hat, that, you know, it's all of the above, it's not one or the other. I want to make that on the record so that nobody gets offended by that. Any other questions? Okay, we'll get you out of here 5 minutes early. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the speakers for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.